Hello, YouTube. My name is Alan, and it's that time once again. Let's talk metal. Actually, tonight we're going to be talking more punk and hardcore. Going to do a book review. The book in question this time that I recently finished reading is Punk Paradox, a memoir by Greg Graffin. Apologies if I'm mispronouncing the name. I'm guessing it's Graffin, but I've never heard the name pronounced anywhere. Greg, of course, is longtime sort of band leader, songwriter, vocalist for Bad Religion. And this was published in 2022. And yeah, it is exactly what it says. It's kind of, a memoir, autobiography of his life and times. And the title's appropriate because there are a lot of things that are a little bit paradoxical about Greg as a, punk and, the music that the band has done. First thing to know about this is that it is much more of an autobiography for Greg rather than a history of the band Bad Religion. The way this book is written, it's not about the band, and Greg was part of it. It's more like, this book is about Greg, and he happened to be part of Bad Religion. That means at times there are parts of Bad Religion's background and history that really aren't touched on in great detail. For example, the book really kind of just breezes right past the making of the debut album, How Could Hell Be Any Worse? Which feels a little strange because, it was the one album they made during the, early 80s, punk explosion. You'd think that would be something they would delve into, that he'd write a lot about, but it really doesn't. So it's almost a little bit of an afterthought. I was like, oh yeah, we made the album, put it out, and it's talked about a little bit here and there, but there's not like a whole chapter about the making of the album or the impact of the album. No, not whatsoever. Yeah, instead, you get multiple chapters, for example, on his childhood and upbringing. That's the kind of thing that some people don't always find very interesting in these books, which is why I'm pointing it out so that you know what you're getting into if you pick this book up. Now, full disclosure here, I know a very little about Bad Religion. I've had a couple of their albums over the years and liked them, but I probably haven't listened to the band in 10 years or so. Would I pick some more stuff up by them if I saw them? Yeah. I just never see their albums show up in, local used places. So I've never really followed up on the band in any great detail. But I do enjoy the stuff I've heard. The ones I've heard, to be clear, I've heard, How Can Hell Be Any Worse? And a couple of the albums from the late 80s, early 90s. I think Against the Grain was one I had. Maybe there's one like Eye Against Eye or something like that. Albums from that period where they were starting to kind of find their groove again. But so yeah, anyway, if you're wanting a blow by blow account of every album and all the details that went into recording each one, this is not the book for you. This is not what's included in here. As I said, this is a lot more autobiographical. Excuse me, a little more autobiographical because it really is pointing at, here's my life and how I got involved in punk and what my take on punk as a scene is and why I approached songwriting the way I did, why Bad Religion kind of evolved the way it did. Evolution is definitely a theme in the book. Greg, of course, famously went on to, get his doctorate in, biology. He has a strong background in geology, paleontology. And having this kind of heavy academic background, it comes from a lot of his upbringing. Both his parents were academics, so he was raised in kind of that world that was all very normal to him. But his parents also divorced when he was pretty young. His mom relocated to Southern California, so he kind of had this weird double life of having one foot in the Southern California, punk scene as it was coming up, and Southern California was becoming this kind of, big stereotype or microcosm of, suburban life in the 80s. But then also spending, part of every year back in Wisconsin with his father, where, it was more kind of a little bit more of a rustic, Rust Belt kind of community and stuff. A lot more what we would think of maybe as laid back or rural, even though it wasn't like way out in the sticks kind of thing. One funny little anecdote he tells that kind of highlights this difference is that when he went back to spend the summer in Wisconsin around the time he was 15, I think. He told some of his friends that, yeah, he had already had sex. So, and they were just flabbergasted. And the quote he gives, which is priceless, is that, one of his friends from Wisconsin just said, is like, "You've done fornication?" Which, yes, the phrase "done fornication," yeah, priceless. But, it really highlighted, the kind of, different worlds he felt, he was always kind of pulled in these two directions. He still had, these, longtime childhood friends in Wisconsin that he got along great with, and they did all the outdoor stuff. But then he was also a part of this much more suburban and urban Hollywood punk scene that was developing in Southern California. And so a big part of it is him explaining how he's always kind of pulled in different directions. So the background material about his childhood and upbringing, it definitely plays into the narrative. You can kind of tell it's him making sense of his life. It's just like, here's how did I get here? Well, it really did start way back then with, these early memories and things that happened even before my parents were divorced. So the information is very relevant to the story he's telling. It's just not all about bad religion. That's not the focus of the story. Parts of Bad Religion that he does spend more time on. I feel like he spends more time talking about that once they kind of get into the late 80s, early 90s. Again, Bad Religion didn't put out a ton of stuff in the early days of punk. The first album is kind of become a thing over time. That's the one most people have heard of or recognize. Their second album was very different and, as Greg notes, very poorly received at the time. He was trying to do something different with the music. It didn't go over well. There's a lot of lineup ins and outs. And so it was a while before the band kind of found its groove and started, getting maybe a more consistent delivery with music and albums. That's where he spends a little more time talking about the band, how they were, they kept going this whole time. They never had completely broken up or disbanded. But that there were some lulls where they weren't doing as much, and then periods where, he was able to start getting back into it. And part of this, again, was being pulled in two directions, where he was trying to go to college, work on his degrees in biology and geology, but never wanting to completely give up the punk scene either, that he still felt like he had something to contribute there and, wanted to participate in to a degree. That kind of leads to another paradox, with Greg's life that he's trying to sort out and explain here, is that, as he, describes himself, he was, what a lot of people at a glance would refer to as very straight edge in punk community. Now, he doesn't describe himself as part of the straight edge punk movement. If anything, he doesn't seem to be very enamored with that movement. But he makes it very clear that he was never really interested in all the drugs or just, getting drunk for the sake of getting drunk. As a kid who was raised, in more sort of intellectual upbringing, that stuff just didn't have much appeal to him. And that he was much more, interested sort of in, punk's early, messaging as a youth movement and stuff. He wasn't there for the, just, random fucked up nihilism or anything like that. He was there as a form of, because it was a form of expression that, he saw value in. And that's where things got, very dicey for him in like the mid 80s. There's a good description. And I'll read one quick section here in a second. But, a message that he repeats several times in the book, is that, he was really unhappy with, how punk kind of devolved in the mid 80s into just playing into the bad stereotype of being a bunch of losers who just wanted to, go out and smash things. And the follow-up to that, that kind of started by the late 80s, where a lot of people who had been on the scene, would get interviewed and stuff, and it seemed that all they wanted to do was kind of play into those bad stereotypes too, and talk about how, everything was just total debauchery and, screwed up and losers and all that, which again was kind of antithetical to what Greg had seen in the punk movement at the very beginning, in the very early 80s, latest 70s, and where, he wanted to be and how he wanted to contribute to it. So yeah, let's see. Quick summary where he goes. So yeah, and he talks too about, how this is partially tied into the politics of the early 80s. That, those of you younger may not realize it, but yeah, it was a very conservative time with Reagan politics. A lot of that was, rampant in the early 80s. Duh, duh, duh. But yeah, so here a quick quote on kind of his commentary on the whole thing. In short, gang mentality, thrived in this anti-intellectual climate of the mid 1980s. The stereotyping of punk rock as a nihilistic, hopeless community of drug-addled, lazy, never-do-wells, intent on breaking laws and smashing property had reached an apex. And most punk concerts at the time were filled with fans who were only too happy to live up to the stereotype. And that was the period where, yeah, Greg kind of feels punk, bottomed out in a way, that it just kind of became the joke that people outside the scene had always tried to cast it as. But as I said, there's a lot of description too about how things changed moving into the 90s. He comments a lot about kind of the rise of punk, the return of punk in the mid 90s with the popularity of bands like Green Day, The Offspring, Blink 182, I think is the other one that he talks about from time to time. And the funny thing is, from his perspective, is that Bad Religion just kind of kept going this whole time. And eventually, so yes, you got to this point where this new generation of bands came along that kind of looked up to them. They're like, oh yeah, you were a big influence on us. And he's like, okay, that's cool. He doesn't describe it, in terms of jealousy or anything like that, but he does spell it out. It's like I'm just always kind of scratching my head that these other bands come up, after us and become extremely popular, and they're playing punk music, but with a very commercial friendly, appetizing kind of flavor to it. He's like, they're not necessarily saying it's fun. They're not just saying anything very important, and they're definitely moving away from the kind of messaging of the original punk movement. He talks, for example, how punk in that time in the 90s and especially into the 21st century becomes this kind of commodity, whereas originally it was more of a counterculture movement, kind of pushing back against all the consumerism and materialism of mainstream society. And as this next wave of punk bands becomes popular, it all becomes a hot topic kind of thing. It's just like, oh yeah, I can get the little Bad Religion symbol on my keychain and stuff. And again, it's something that just kind of strikes him as a bit paradoxical. That it's great that punk came back, and people got interested in it and enjoyed it again. It obviously helped his band along, even though they never enjoyed that same level of mainstream success that a band like Green Day achieved. But, Bad Religion were on Atlantic Records for several years. They toured extensively. They did well for themselves, but they never got to the top of the heap. They were always a little under the radar. But he also kind of reflects on that and is like, maybe it's not such a bad thing. It allowed us to kind of stay on message and not get distracted. And the message was a big thing for Greg. And that's one of the other big themes in the book, is that, to him, punk was always meant to be, a vehicle, and Bad Religion for him was a way to try to inject, this more enlightened view into punk, which in his mind is something that punk was trying to do in the very beginning, that it wasn't supposed to just become a bunch of windmill kicks and nihilism that a lot of bands wallowed in. And it wasn't supposed to be this huge mainstream hot topic mass consumerism thing that later bands became. That he wanted to have an actual message, an actual ethos, like here, think about things. He describes it towards the very end of the book, if I can find that section, which I might not be able to because I don't think I bookmarked it, which is a bad decision. But here we go. I think it's right around here. Let's see. This is yeah. Punk, pushing on in spite of obstacles, championing the spirit of enlightenment, values, and sharing knowledge rather than doctrine. Such practices have turned out perhaps to be the most punk thing anyone could accomplish. And that's kind of he summarizes his contribution to punk, that it was not to preach to people. It wasn't to play into the stereotypes. It was to try to get people to think, to look at things and broaden their horizons a bit, which is something he always tried to convey into his lyrics. And so, okay, cool enough. Uh, Beyond that, again, other things about the band and its history sometimes do get glossed over. As you get close to the end of the book, he gets to a certain point describing their tours in Europe and such, which he spends a lot of time on. But then you get to a point a few pages from the end, it's like, and then we kept doing the same thing for the next 15 years. And that's about it. So there's very little about, the recent history of the band. When longtime member, Greg Heston had to leave the band, there's literally like 2 sentences about it, and it's literally like right here at the very last moment in the book. And he doesn't say anything. All he says is, that, let's see, I can find it, it's kind of following the discussion, when his mom passed away, and that, made the departure of the ousting of my bandmate and pal, Greg Heston, feel less acute. It was a loss too. Greg deserved better from me, but I couldn't be there for him when his tenure in Bad Religion was revoked. How this came to be is a tale for another time, and it's best to let him tell it someday. And that's all he says about, Greg Heston, who, was, a huge contributing member of the band for a long time. That's it. There's nothing else about that in here. Yeah, I've looked into that a little bit online, and that's seems to be one of those topics that's always been a little bit fuzzy and vague. If you know more of the details about what finally panned out with Heston's departure from Bad Religion, feel free to leave a comment below and let people know what was going on with that. But it's just kind of another good highlight how, this is not a history of Bad Religion. You're not getting, all the ins and outs and all the dirt and stuff like that. Sure, there are lots of anecdotes sprinkled in through the book about crazy things they did and all this, but it is definitely not the focus of the book. That said, it's still a very good read and interesting. Perhaps it's a little more interesting to me than it will be to some other folks. Again, even though I'm not a big fan of the band, I can relate to a lot of Greg's professional career stuff, where he describes, having to go through grad school, work on these different projects in biology and geology. Yeah, that is something I can relate to since I went through, college and worked on a doctorate in paleontology as well. So all of that part of it, connects with me a little bit more than it might the average reader. So yeah, if you're really into the band, it should be an interesting read on his background. If you're just sort of interested in the history of punk, you get some of that through here, but very much through the lens of what Greg was trying to accomplish with the band. If you're looking for a comprehensive, the life and times of Bad Religion, you'll get some information here, but it's not going to be exactly what you're looking for. But a good read nevertheless. I enjoyed it. I picked it up on a whim because I found it at one of the local used bookstores for $10, and I was like, yeah, absolutely. For $10, I will spend a few days checking that out, and I'm glad I did. That's enough for this review. So now let's talk Bad Religion and related topics in the comments down below. Are there certain albums by this band that people should check out? Again, I have very, very shallow dive into their catalog so far. If there are key albums you think people would enjoy, leave a comment below. If there, again, are other parts of Bad Religion's history that you think are really pertinent that people should be aware of, feel free to add some anecdotes down below as well. And if nothing else, I think they're a cool act because they're one of those, excuse me, one of those, early bands that were really on the SoCal scene that kept going all the way through the 80s and 90s and up to, the 21st century. Most of those bands, of course, flamed out kind of early, or they ended up maybe, with massive, time gaps where nothing was done, and then they got back together for shows here or there. But Bad Religion was always kind of there, but always in the background. They were never one of the major forces pointed to in hindsight from the early days of California punk, and even into the 21st century. They were never the band you were going to hear on the radio with the big hits and all this kind of stuff. But they were always there. They were always a presence and always a force that people on the scene were aware of and many appreciated. And I'd say that's a pretty cool legacy. All right, let's wrap this one up. Until next time, everybody take care, and as always, keep windmilling, kicking people in the face in the pit. or not.